Hey guys, good to see you all. This is an interesting experiment. This is the second one of these I've tried in the last few weeks where we're trying to do a presentation over video conference. Usually I'm speaking at STAR or a bigger conference where I have that interaction with the people in the room. So part of this is just the experiment of trying to keep that dynamic and keep it active. So anyway, this is a really cool opportunity. I got a chance to speak with the QA team down at Chick-fil-A in Atlanta doing a similar conference call just a week ago, and it went pretty good. So if you see us tweaking a few things here or there, we're just working on how to make it more effective, but basically that's it. So I'm just curious. I can barely see most of you, but I can see enough to see if your hands are raised. How many of you have ever heard of METS before? Anybody? All right, a couple of you, maybe 2 or 3 of you there. So today I'm going to go over just kind of the story of it and give you some basic tools that you can come away with. And so I think we'll go ahead and just jump on in. I will try to have some Q&A time at the end, and if you jump up and wave, I may be able to see you and stop and we can take a question that way. But you're about the size of a postage stamp on my screen right now, so pretty small. I want to talk about in 2001, let me get my clicker here and kind of switch over my screen. In 2001, I joined this company that's well known for late night photocopy sessions. I'm imagining a number of you have probably used this company's services, and it was my first official role as a QA engineer. I've got all my team members walking across the hall here wondering what in the world's going on, so if you see me distracted from time to time, they're walking past there. Anyway, as a new QA guy, I've been testing a long time before this, really since the 1980s, but to have that title as QA engineer started around 2001. And I always knew I love fixing and breaking stuff and digging in and trying to understand how things were working. So, you know, I was given a desk at this place called Kinkos.com. Their corporate office was in California. And basically told, you're now officially a QA guy, and that's how I jumped into this world of QA. So again, my name's Greg Paskal, and I live here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm native from California, but I love Tennessee. It's a beautiful place. And I work for this guy named Dave Ramsey. Some of you may have heard of him. He has a radio show and is real well known for getting folks out of debt and helping them manage their finances well. A couple years ago, I was asked to come and lead their automation efforts. It's an area that I'm really passionate about, and I speak on quite a bit. This talk really precedes a lot of the automation I'm doing now, but it actually is connected in a way that it leads into some of the automation efforts I do as of today. Started with something that I learned back in building this test strategy. So METS really stands for Minimal Essential Testing Strategy, and it's really simple. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed that this is some gigantic thing you're going to have to learn here in a few minutes. Over the course of the talk, I'm going to go over the basic METS concepts, and I'm going to give you some tools on how to begin building a basic METS grid. So you probably could go back to your office this afternoon and actually start this process. It's that easy. And then I'm going to cover a few advanced METS stuff as well. For those people who love to get in and do some coding or working in macros or that sort of stuff, you'll probably like that piece because the imagination can really go and you can do some pretty cool things. So I want to kind of start off with a story here, and let's call it Day in the Life of a QA Engineer. And this really kind of reflects how I got started here. So the phone rings, and I answer it, and it's my developer that I support at Kinkos. His name is Adam. I'm like, hey, Adam, what's up? And he said, oh, I have a change for you to test. It's just a small email change. And I said, okay, well, that seems pretty easy. It was on our web pages, and Adam owned Kinkos.com. It was really just 2 guys, me as his tester and him as the developer. And I said, well, where are these email changes made? And he said, on the press releases. And I said, well, there are a lot of press releases, aren't there? And I said, like 40 of them? And he said, well, actually, there's 48. So I said, so you've changed 48 pages? And he said, yeah, but it's just one email change, and that's all I've done. And by the way, I need them by noon. Yeah, today. And I don't know about you, but seems to be a reoccurring thing I have found in my QA career over time, is we generally have this sort of situation where we're presented with something to test in a really limited time frame. So it's kind of the norm and something I'm sure all of you have encountered in your QA work. So here are some of the common challenges that we face in QA, of course. That we have frequent changes to the applications we test. We usually have a minimal amount of time for sufficient test coverage. And unfortunately, there can be really unrealistic expectations of what we can get done in the amount of time that we're given. It's just the nature of the beast, if you will, and how it goes. So here is some thoughts on how people perceive a simple email change. Tell me if I'm wrong, but so far this is something I've seen reoccurring. So from the perception of the person doing the asking, that could even be the developer or the business owner, they think, well, is the email link working? They think you're just going to click this, and that'll take a minute or two, and at the end of that, should be good to go, and there shouldn't be any more problems. But any of you that are QA guys, you're probably thinking like this other column here. Yeah, is the email link working? Does it launch the email client? Is the email recipient correct? This thing is going to, and has anything else changed on the page that I should be checking? So it's pretty obvious. There's at least 4 different items, bullet items here that show even on a basic link change like that, we're going to have a really different way of looking at the changes that are made. Let's see, my clicker is stopped working here. Here we go. So I want to tell you another story. Again, this was kind of early on in my official QA role. I call it the story of the $5,000 giveaway. So once upon a time, there was $5,000 that someone needed to give away, and they were going to go ahead. My company was going to run this contest, basically with this giveaway. And in order for folks to enter the contest, they had to call an 800 number. So again, being kind of a new QA guy and curious about things, I thought, well, yeah, it has an 800 number here on this web page, and it's sprinkled throughout the site. But I wondered, is this the right phone number? So I thought, well, what better way to test it than I'm going to just call it, see what happens. So I called the 800 number, and guess what happened? This nice lady answered, and I explained to her, I said, hi, I'm Greg. I work for Kinko's, and I'm testing this website, and we're about to publish this number that I just called to tell folks to call here to enter a contest for $5,000. And this poor lady, she said, oh my gosh, I have no idea what you're talking about. And we had actually published the wrong 800 number, and she was about to get inundated with all these calls. So just an idea around that simple thing as a QA person really saved us in some bad press and a reputation of publishing this person's poor 800 number that wasn't related to our company at all. It was just a misprint. And we got it fixed, thankfully, before it went live. So I think through this this experience, I really learned how important it was to pay attention to the details. And I realized that when time is really under a crunch, that's kind of our worst time to determine how we're going to test something. So what I started to do as a new QA guy is I said, next time that shows up, I had a yellow page note tablet just like this that you see on the screen. And I thought, write down the things that I want to make sure I do when time is of the essence. And someone comes to me and says, you have 10 minutes to test this. And I literally started scribbling it down, and I'd set it next to my desk, and there would be a new one I hadn't thought of, and I would just add it, and it grew. I wish I had that original piece of paper. I'm sure it's filed somewhere. So through that process of I'm a real list creator, and I always love to kind of organize things. Through that process of creating that list, it started to get larger and larger, if you could imagine. And every time I found one more thing that I needed to test, I added it to the list. And through that process, what you're learning today was born, called METS. And I'm so excited to share with you today. This is a methodology that's being used by a lot of folks out there. We're using it exclusively here at Ramsey for all of our manual test efforts funnel through the METS methodology. So let's talk a little bit about METS. It's really a solution or a strategy to help you get the essential testing done when you only have a very limited amount of time. Okay? It is a strategy, and it's a strategy that's meant to be used when you've prepared it ahead of time. So it really is dependent upon the fact that you know things are going to get sent over to you. In some cases, they're going to get thrown over the wall at the last minute, and then you're going to be like, all right, how long do I have? And they're going to say, this has to go out as fast as you can get this done. It needs to go live. That happens to us here. That's happened to me in every place I've worked up to this point. And so I don't think that's going to change anytime, because for business needs, that may be a reality that they just need to get it done quick. All right. So really, METS is about having a battle plan in place. It is not the following things. It's not something you're going to buy off the shelf. It's actually free. You can get it off my website. It's not that complicated. You can figure it out even without the website. Likely, I had a gentleman connect with me on LinkedIn just yesterday who said he was creating something similar, and he found this process. So it's something somewhat logical for folks, especially list creators. This is going to make a lot of sense to you. It's not a silver bullet, so this isn't going to solve all the testing problems that you have. It complements other testing strategies really well. It can guide exploratory testing really, really well. That's probably how we initially started using it here, and we've evolved it to more than that now, but that's a great place to begin using it. It's going to meet a lot of your needs, and it's going to be really helpful, again, with your exploratory testing. So let's start by going over some foundational METS concepts. And as we go through these, I'm looking through my notes here, so excuse me for looking down here time again, but as we go through these, I want you to consider your application, the one you just left as you came here for lunch, and what does that look like kind of in light of what you're learning about METS? Because I bet you'll learn some things right away. Matter of fact, if you had a tablet next to you, you might start writing down the very test that would wind up on your METS grid. All right, so let's start. Some foundational METS concepts. One of them is around the area of identification. Things can be viewed from various perspectives. There's a physical perspective and there's a functional perspective. The physical perspective is generally anything that's touchable on an application, like a button or an edit field or a slider of some sort, any kind of graphic. The functional perspective, of course, is going to be the actions of the application. This would be starting and stopping and logging in and adding an item to a cart and maybe returning something, that sort of idea. So let's look at an analogy here of a van from the physical perspective. So there's a few things with this van that we can identify physically. It's got tires, it's got some lights, and it's got some glass. These are just a few physical things with the van. Again, it's really simple, this concept, and we can look at it from that perspective. Now I want to kind of switch it around and look at it from that functional perspective instead. Okay, so functionally, this van has the ability to accelerate. It's got stopping capabilities. It's got the ability to light itself along the road and keep it cool from the engine overheating. Those two ideas from the physical and functional are very important as you're starting to think about creating a METS strategy. All right, another foundational concept about METS is around this idea of prioritization. Really, when you think about prioritization, it's all about when someone comes in a panic and they said, I need to get this tested, what do you want to get done over anything else versus the things that really don't matter? So these are four areas that I use in the METS test strategy, which is a prioritization of critical, high, medium, and low. You may have some different ones. That's fine. These work out pretty good. They've held the test of time. And so again, the most important things are going to get identified as critical all the way down to the least important things. So let's go back to that van and consider it. How we're going to prioritize a couple things. We're going to just look at the tires right now. All right, so from the most critical thing with the tires is, by far, there needs to be 4 tires on that van. If it's got 3, you got big trouble. You're not going to make it too far down the road. So the most critical physical attribute of that van, at least in this example, is going to be those tires. The next one down might be the condition. So we would say, man, if there was an emergency, I would want to make sure all the tires were on the van and ready to go. But the condition I can probably live with. If they're a little worn out, I can still get to the emergency room, or I can get to whatever I need to real quickly. So we bump this guy down to a condition of high, or high condition. The next one down is, of course, a medium, which would be the pressure of those tires. And again, that's not the biggest deal. You can drive pretty far even if the tires are low. It's not great for them, and it's going to wear them out. But you get the general idea. And last but not least is going to be, are the tires balanced? So again, from that physical perspective, this would be a simple way of prioritizing how we would look at the tires and their values. Let's do the same thing now, but let's flip it around from that functional prioritization. All right, so instead of the tires, now we're going to look at the stopping attributes or aspects of the van. So most of you could think, what's the most critical thing related to stopping? Is going to be that it completely stops at the end of the day. And I know where I grew up in Southern California, we had some amazing hills. I lived near a beach city, and I'm telling you, I wouldn't want to come down there knowing my van didn't stop completely, because I would wind up rear-ending someone about 3 miles down the bottom of a hill. So again, a real important critical test. Oops, there we go. Our next one would be that at the high prioritization is that we can stop in the expected time frame. So again, we've got to make sure it stops completely. The next one is, I anticipated I was going to stop in 100 feet, and yes, I did that, or no, I didn't. As a QA guy, you would think, yeah, if I have to stop at 150 feet, but I thought I was in 100, we would probably call that a defect or a bug. Our medium prioritization is around wet conditions. Can we stop under wet conditions? And the last might be that the emergency brake is working. Just some general examples, but it's kind of to help you get in this mindset of thinking a little different about the way we view things. So let's take this time now and transition in what it would be like for you to build a basic METS test strategy for your application. And I encourage you, if you want, go ahead and start jotting some things down as we walk through this. Okay, so we have 2 fundamentals that comes to building this basic METS strategy. The first one is we're going to create what we call the physical test grid. This is going to look somewhat like an Excel spreadsheet. You're going to see an example of that. So physical test grid, I'll just read the definition here, is contains touchable components of your application, such as pages, graphics, forms, links, text. Anything you could physically touch in that application would wind up on that physical test grid. Okay, create a list of these things for your application. I like to put it in an Excel spreadsheet. That's probably where you're going to wind up creating these. By the way, there's a lot of great online ones now. So consider using, like, our wiki even has a decent spreadsheet style application that allows these things to be in the cloud. That's turning out to be really helpful for our team. Remember that you want to step back from kind of the 10,000 foot view perspective at times to look at the application. I'm always amazed when I do that, the things that I see that are just right there all along, but I didn't catch them. A great example of one of those is facts on a page. So textual facts, it could be, where's your corporate office located? It could be, who to contact under these sort of things. That's one that I didn't catch right away, and then maybe a year into having METS, I'm like, this is still something that's touchable on the application. So there are things like that that when you really zoom back from it, you'll start to identify. So here's that Excel look as we're building it out, again at the 10,000 foot level, and I write down those. You can see I've got a column here called categories on the left-hand side, and I've actually notated those things you've just written down underneath those. That's going to guide us into the test that we're going to create around these sorts of things. Remember that METS is a living document, so don't assume you're going to finish this. As a matter of fact, don't even try to finish it to begin with. If you do, you might even get discouraged and just hang it up. I would start with just the basics that you can come up with right away, knowing you're going to keep adding to it. So that's a very reasonable way to go about this, and I think it'll really help you to be successful with it. Some folks go real crazy with this, and they try to think of everything that it would take, and that can burn you out. It's better to rediscover them. In some cases, it comes from identifying even a defect or something down the field, and you're like, oh, I hadn't thought of that, like the 800 number situation. Maybe there's something like that shows up, like we hadn't thought of that. The first thing we do as our team is we say, let's make sure we add that to our METS grids so that we've got it covered for the next go-round. And that's been a great way to add to it. It keeps it manageable as well. All right, so here's a typical, let's see what I've got here. We're going to go ahead and look at a typical web application. I think this is for one of our websites here at Ramsey. And I've identified the images, buttons. There's those facts that I was talking about. Of course, we've got forms and links on this page. There's probably other things we can see. There's some graphics there and other things. I guess we've got that covered in images. But this gives you just a general idea of things that you can begin with. So now we're going to go ahead and build on the physical test grid. We're going to go ahead and add those first critical tests. So think about this. This one is really generic. This is almost web page agnostic. Any kind of web page we would be able to use, the one we're building right now, since it's around pages. So I added a new column called critical. Remember, we've got that prioritization in place. And what's the very first test I put in there, which is that the page completes loading? It's kind of a no-brainer, but imagine you hire a new QA engineer, right? You've got a great candidate. They're a great fit for the culture, but you've got to teach them the basics of QA. This is a perfect tool you can put in their hands and say, man, whenever you test a web page, make sure it completes loading, and here's how you'll know that's the case. In Chrome, it looks like this. In Firefox, it looks like this. In Safari, this is an indicator the page has loaded. And let's face it, with the types of pages we're working on now, they're more dynamic than ever. So we've got content that's changing, and that could mean that there's AJAX calls and things like that are happening that might not have a strong page indicator. So this has even changed from when I created this initial grid. This whole approach has changed. And what is a good indicator that a page is completely loaded or not? Also on a page, critical things are that graphics, text, and other elements are in generally the right place. So, they can sweep through it and say, this generally looks like it's the what it should look like, and everything is set up proper. Also, I want to let you know that there's samples of these grids. Actually, I think I've got a good sample of all of them on my website. They're free to download, and you can get it at metstesting.com. It's up right now. There's even a recording of a presentation I did, this same presentation for the ASTQB testing qualification board they asked me to do. So you can even see that online if you want a refresher. All right, so here's kind of what I came up with after we completed this initial physical test grid. And I love adding color and other dimensions to things, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. So in this case, I've added red for critical because that's usually a good color for that, and just progressed it down to blue being low. All of those things really helped me to pull this thing up. I've actually got a copy of mine right here, and I don't know if you can see it, but I pulled it up real quick. It's just the same thing you see on the screen, and I could say, man, I've got to get this quickly tested. And I could scan through that real quick and make sure I've got the coverage I want. It's such a great tool, and I think it's probably what attracts people to use it most, and even why ASTQB came and asked me to do this. This is actually taught now as a valid manual test strategy with ASTQB as well, so it's a real honor that they've seen the value in it. It's proven to be very helpful for us. Really, if you just think about the reality that when stuff shows up and there's a panic to get it done, that's when we're usually we're not sharp always, and we're kind of like in a panic mode to get it tested. This is a great thing to come into play and help make sure you've got kind of your wits about you, and you can have a good test strategy in place. All right, now some of you guys are Excel gurus, I bet. Let me grab a drink here real quick. I don't know what it is about QA people in Excel, but I have met a ton of them that love to get in there and mix up the data. I'm one of those guys too. So once I had that data in that METS grid, boy, the wheels started spinning, and I'm like, I got another idea. What would happen if I flattened this data out? Or I basically took that data and I put it in a different format. And that's what a few of these next sheets are going to be. So this whole idea of slicing and dicing up the METS data in different ways is going to reveal some things that are going to be really helpful to your team. Your QA manager is going to love some of this stuff. So you'll notice I've added 2 more columns. We still have category, but now I've kind of laid it out as its own column. And importance, it has its own column, and 2 new ones, time required and potential severity. So if you look at a page, let's look at the very first one here. Page completes loading. Well, yeah, that's a pretty critical test. That's how we had it marked in the original grid. But it doesn't take long. This takes me, I put a minute down here. I usually try to keep things to no less than a minute. But if that page did not load, that's going to be a bad deal. And so I put it as a severity 1. You may call this a critical. Whatever you decide to call it in your defect management tool is what you would want to record in here. But the whole idea is that now I have a way of saying what are all my, my severity 1 or my critical defects, or the things that would be really bad to break. And so now if I'm in a real crunch, not only do I have the importance category, which is, you can see in the second column there, but I have potential severity, and I can actually sort upon those 2, and maybe I've only got a half a dozen test cases that in that 5 minutes I've been given, those are the ones I need to run at the end of the day. So again, just be creative with this. You can find a lot of ways to spin this data, and I'm going to show you a few more here. But I love the process of discovering it. It's just really, really cool. All right, so I think we're going to transition. Yeah, we're transitioning to our next one here. So we're going to talk about creating the functional test grid. Okay, we did the physical. Now we're going to do the functional. It's going to be a similar process we just went through. You'll wind up having probably 2 grids like the one that we just saw. Now the cool thing about the physical test grid is, from what I've seen, they're very application agnostic. So the one I'm holding in my hands is one I could use for any website that exists. It's real generic. It's got some things that might not even be covered on every page, but generally speaking, this is a great go-to. Think about your mobile apps. I haven't yet to create one of these for mobile, but it would be fantastic because we know mobile is going to have a common set of things that are going to apply no matter what the app is that you can do. Whereas the functional test grid tends to be more application specific. All right, so let's take a look at that. This should look pretty familiar. We basically created that same style of Excel spreadsheet, and you'll notice that I've got some categories up here that I've identified for, I think I chose a classic and maybe an e-commerce application or something similar to that. So you can see already how this gets more specific to your application. But all of us probably have, e-commerce style of application. So I said, well, one of my categories is going to be related to accounts, shopping carts, locators, maybe search functionality, transactional things like paying, maybe returns, a catalog, that sort of stuff. Whatever that would look like for your solution, go ahead and mark those in that category section. All right, see, I'm going to move us along a little faster on this slide. So here we've got it now built out. We've got it all colorized. It looks pretty cool. And so consider the category of type accounts. So what's a critical one for all of our websites would be, can you create an account? Can that person log in? Those 2 things. Is it really a surprise that they're in that upper left corner? Well, of course not. Those are going to be the real critical things. And again, remember, there's going to be a time someone's going to come to you and they're going to say, I need this tested right away. And this tool is going to be a good reminder for you. There's going to be other times you might bring on a new QA engineer. This could be a great tool to put in their hands and say, I want you to do all the critical tests for this release. And they're able to go right down this list and pick them off one at a time and fulfill it. I think I'm going to take a quick detour here. I don't have this in my notes, but I want to tell you about one of the things that we're doing now at Ramsey Solutions with this example. So let's talk about that creating an account. First one there. We're now allowing that to lead us in the manual test cases that we create. So if you think about it, if you're a subject matter expert of your application, it's going to be pretty easy for you to know what you need to do to create an account. You've already done this 10,000 times before, so you're able to go into autopilot and fulfill it. If you've got that younger guy who's coming in, he's going to need more of a hand-holding and walk through the process. So what we've committed to do is go ahead and document in a step-by-step format at least the critical test. And that means we're going to have a couple dozen of these things. It's something that could be done in a pretty short amount of time. And it's a regular part of our teams, kind of the day in the life of a QA tester, to visit their METS grid, to update it to new stuff, and to consider, hey, I've got some time on my hands. Why don't I go ahead and document another annual test case? We try to balance this out, how much documentation we create, knowing we've got subject matter experts of applications. And that really comes from an observation I've made, and probably many of you have seen as well, which is sometimes there's a temptation to create 10,000 manual test cases and they never get run. It just becomes an enormous book of test cases, but no one ever can run it because it's disorganized, and they go on forever and they get out of date. And that's what I'm really trying to avoid with using this process. By having METS, which is essentially like a table of contents of testing, you have at least a place to start. You have subject matter experts' ability to jump in here and get the testing done that needs to get done, and then there can be manual test cases to help for those that need that additional piece. So right at the end of the day, what's testing all about? Reducing risk. So we're reducing risk. If you realize it's not strong enough, then go ahead and add more details. So you're keeping the risk as low as possible. And if you need a manual test case, do it. There's no reason not to. It's not a hard, fast rule. All right, so here I've kind of spun that data again in another format. Remember how we did this before, where we took it and flattened it out? So I call this one the functional test metrics. Again, I've added those two new columns called time required and potential severity. And boy, when I hit it this way, lots of people got interested. Developers got interested. Business folks got interested, because now they're like, it takes how long to test this? Or what's the one that if it broke, it's going to be a really, the showstopper defect? They were able to look at this, and I was able to share it with them, and it was really, really valuable. So again, just being curious and mixing up the data in different formats allowed us to get a great win out of this. All right, guys, I'm going to transition now into some advanced METS concepts. Any questions up to this point?
Hey, I don't know if you can see me, but I'm just curious to get a little more what you mean the difference between importance and severity.
This gets brought up a lot of times. So this really got introduced to me with our defect management tools. So realize this kind of goes back. When I first was introduced to some defect management tools, I think it was Quality Center the first time, we had what we called Sev1 bugs. Those were our worst defects. And so that's when I'm saying that if this test failed or if this functionality failed, this would be a severity 1. It means that this would be a pretty bad problem. So, there's other metrics we could be talking about as well, and I don't want to get those mixed up in here like root cause and other things like that. So think of severity as if something failed on your application right now and you had to communicate that to your developer, you would say, hey, nobody can log in. What would you call that in your company? We would call it a Sev1 or a really severe defect, a critical defect. Whatever you call that, translate that idea into the concepts your company uses. Does that help?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Anything else? We'll get another one. All right.
So I've got a question about the high, medium, and low columns.
Yeah.
How often do you find that you actually run the medium or low? Because I would think that most time, because you're under a time crunch, it's usually the criticals and highs, and the medium and lows kind of get kicked down the curb, and then next time we'll get to it, and you don't get to it the next time, and it just keeps continuing that trend.
You're right. I mean, it's kind of the classic test case problem too, right? It's those ones at the back of the book that never get run. That's a real reality. We try to keep tests on there that are really only going to be, legitimately run from time to time. So maybe that's the regression suite, is everything in there. So those tests do get run, but you're right, they kind of become the ones that are least run. But I still think it's a good idea to document them and have them down, because it gives you a good picture of the landscape of your application. And what would prevent you if you've got a couple QA folks on the team where one guy decides he's going to take the criticals and highs, and maybe you send your junior guy off to look at the the mediums and the lows. It gives you a lot of flexibility of how you can approach testing. Good question. All right, guys. Well, I got our last little section here is some advanced METS stuff, and I may freeform a little bit at the end too, because we're still even discovering some new things to do. But I want to go over some basic things that that I wound up doing as I was exploring this concept further. So I'm one of those guys that's always stepping back from a problem and trying to look at it from different perspectives and look at it. And I realized as a tester, there were 3 ways I started to look at the way changes were made and the types of testing that I can do. And so that's covered here. The first one was something I called direct testing, and I'm just going to read it off the screen. That's testing pertaining to the obvious changes or fix. So if edit field had been changed and the password field, password and user ID were changed, then I'm going to obviously check at least those 2 fields. I'm going to put it really through the ringer. Then I also thought, well, there are things that are related that got changed as well. So I came up with this idea of related testing, tests pertaining to areas that might have been impacted by a change. So again, with that user ID and password screen, if I know the developer has been on there and he's made changes to those, how do I know that he hasn't, fat-fingered something else in there? As a coder, as an automation guy, I have definitely done this a time or two, and it usually comes when I'm distracted and I'm working on a piece of code, and I have to look at an email or someone comes in and I do this, and then I get distracted and realize I just typed it into my code. So that happens every once in a while, even with your devs. So don't be surprised. Things like that happen. So this is where this kind of testing comes into play, which is this developer touched this page or this section of the application. I want to think of it as related testing. And then we have one of your typical regression testing, which is in the day in the life of this application, what are the things I want to test across it that I know this whole application is generally working as expected. So for us, that could be our whole METS grid. There could be things on there that maybe we would skip, but more than likely the things on METS are going to be included in that regression test. All right. So what I started thinking about in this process is, this is funny, I thought about this before I worked for Dave Ramsey. Any of you have ever heard of him, he's all about making a budget. And so, but way back when I created this, when I was working for Kinko's, I thought about a budget as well. So I thought, well, if I'm given a certain amount of time to test something, and I could look at testing from those 3 perspectives of direct testing, related, and regression, how much would I budget to each of those buckets? And so in this case, in the example, I thought, well, okay, how about if I go ahead and give direct testing 25% of my time, related 50%, and regression 25%. You're going to see how that kind of comes into play because I have added yet more columns to my spreadsheet. Again, I just love looking at the way that data kind of reveals more things. And so I simply added these columns and then the ability to put a check mark next to them for each test. And I said, well, okay, this person changed, let's see, I've got creating account possible. So let's assume that this had to do with that user ID and password change. I said, okay, that's something, and also they changed something related to being removed from the cart. So I put an X in those couple things. I said, related testing-wise, these are some things that I think might have been touched, and over here are some regression items I want to make sure I cover. And I was able to take basic, Excel functionality and derive how long would it take to actually test each one of those lines and do some summations at the bottom. Well, your QA manager is probably going to be like my guy. He's going to get excited when you're able to kind of give him an estimate of how long you think it's going to take to do some testing. we're pretty flex here. We know that these are estimates, so we try to handle it as it's not written in stone, but at least it gives us a good idea. Well, this is basically going to take, 30 minutes to do, my related testing or whatever. And if I have a certain amount of budget, now I can go back and add more tests till I've got my fully allotted budget used up. And so I think my next slide here, I'm showing some of that. Yeah. So what I decided is, again, building out this tool a little further. You can download these free on my site. I said, okay, if I'm starting with 4 hours and I've decided to allocate 25% to direct and 50 to related and 25 to regression, that gives me an hour for the first, 2 hours for the related, and an hour for regression. And you can see how I was able to roll those numbers into here and say, well, how much time have I now utilized and how much remains? All right, so again, kind of those Excel gurus probably love this kind of stuff because you realize how far you can take calculations like this. Now, if I had more than those 4 or 5 tests you've seen in my examples here, but I had, let's say, 50 or 60 rows of data, now I'm actually able to really get very specific to not only meeting a reasonable amount of time. So if someone says you've got a half a day to do this, I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, the first 15 minutes of that are going to me coming up with a test strategy based upon this. I'm going to go through and check through here real quick. And now I've got a strategy of how I'm about to test the right things when I'm about to begin my test. So I'll leave this, I'm kind of about ready here to wrap this up, but you could imagine if you took that concept and bumped it up a little more with maybe some macros that could spit these test cases out. They could be passed across the team. There could be various things you could do. You can go crazy with this. I also want to let you know, I'm going to deviate from my talk here a little bit and let you know that when it comes to the METS grids, we are now allowing all of our critical tests to be our candidates for automation. So I'm an automation guy. I've been working in it for over 30 years, believe it or not. And there always comes this question for automation folks, which is, what do we automate? And what's so cool about having METS in place is since we've already done the prioritization, we already know the most critical tests. So why not let those things be the things we automate? It gives us great coverage, and that could maybe be another talk I can do at another time for you guys. But we have found this to be really, really effective, especially if those same test cases get written out manually, step by step. So the process we follow is that the manual test engineer owns the METS grid. They build out manual test cases step by step for all the critical tests. Those get handed to the automation engineer, myself and one other guy, and we automate those to the T of the way that the manual test engineer is asked them to be built. It solves a lot of problems. Now when we have an automated test fail, we know exactly the test case it was created from. The manual engineer goes ahead and executes that. We find out if it's a flaky automated test or if it's a real defect. There's some great wins there. So I really encourage you to look at some options like this. There's some really great ways you can get some good wins out of using METS that will lead into other things down the road. So here's just a little overview of what we walked through, basically how we created the physical test grids and then the physical metrics grids for both physical and functional, and then how we kind of tied it into that budgeter. So some of my last thoughts for you as we're kind of wrapping up today, it's got a couple slides left, is METS really is only going to be as effective as the time you put into it. Generally, this is a no-brainer, but what we find is it's just like automation. If you don't keep investing in it, it goes stale, and people begin to stop using it. You need to blend it into your culture of your team. It's something that can be done very, very easily and become just part of the routine of your team to go ahead and continue to build it out. Begin to build METS by what you know. Don't do too much of a deep dive. Just start with the basics. So it's something you can manage real easy in maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Maybe make it a team event where you come around and think about how to start one of these. And again, think about ways you can slice and dice the data to come up with some pretty cool stuff. They'll evolve. You'll find some cool new stuff. I'd love to hear what you do with it because I do get a lot of people reach out to me who are using this, and they come up with some pretty clever ways of kind of spinning the data. So your first step is start with that physical test grid, and then let it lead you to creating your functional test grid. And you'll be in pretty good shape if you can get that built. And I wanted to leave you with this last slide, which is I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. I have a lot of people who reach out to me who use METS through LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me here and send your questions. I'd be more than happy to answer them the best I can. I've got my link up here as well for metstesting.com. And for any automation folks out there, this was a big step in my life, but I published my first book on test automation. It's available on Amazon called, you can find it on my website, Real World Test Automation, or just go to Amazon and look for test automation in the real world. And you can get the e-version or the printed book. But it's a lot of the knowledge of 30 years of automation kind of summed up in there. So I'd be thrilled for you to get a copy and let me know what you think. That's pretty much all I got for you guys today, so I'm open to any questions you might have.
Okay, I've got a question on the functional and physical grid.
Yeah.
For the, I guess the far left column, I forget what the column header is, almost like what the tests are. The tests themselves.
Okay.
How is there a way that, or a method that you've been able to find that's effective to keeping that so it doesn't become wordy? Because I'm just thinking that sometimes we get caught up with describing something and then it ends up turning into a paragraph.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think this is going to probably be different from user to user. You know, you guys probably know most of your developers probably do code reviews. It would be interesting to do a review, a METS review from time to time to try to keep that, just that balance of enough words to, you know, set that tester off on getting that test built. But when it gets too wordy, you know, you really don't want to spell out the whole test case step for step in there. You know, I generally find I can complete it in a sentence, and I'm a writer, so I always love to go back through and edit things and try to clean them up as much as I can. But good question. Sure appreciate you guys letting me share with you today. And this has been great to give this another try over video conference. But I wish I was there face to face with you. I love spending time with you folks. And if you ever get out at STAR conference, I speak there pretty often. And I'd love to meet you sometime in person. Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate your time.
Jeff was asking, when is the STAR conference?
Well, there's a STAR West conference coming up, I think, in October. My goal is to speak at STAR West next year. I just finished speaking at STAR East a couple months ago. And there's a good chance, are any of you listening to Test Talks with Joe Colantonio? Test Talks folks out there? You heard it? Anyway, that's a great podcast for any automation folks out there. If you don't do it, please pass that on to your automation engineers. I speak regularly on Joe's podcast, testtalks.com. He and I are actually meeting tomorrow, and he has a really great conference called the Automation Guild. It's every year. It's really reasonable. For those of you that have traveled to a conference, you know you're going to spend thousands of dollars. Joe has a virtual conference that's about $200, and it's usually 3 to 5 days long, and like I will go ahead and do a pre-recorded podcast usually, and from there people can log in at any time, and we have live Q&A. So there's some great resources out there for sure. All right, thanks so much, guys. Have a great day now.